A widow thought her husband's secrets died with him. Then her son found blueprints hidden in the walls. Each line drew a truth she was never meant to see. Would you keep building the life he left unfinished? 3 weeks after the funeral, Claire moved through her house like a stranger visiting a museum of her own life. The November afternoon pressed against the windows David had meant to clean, casting pale squares of light across floors he'd planned to refinish. His coffee mug still sat on the side table beside his reading chair, the dried ring at the bottom dark as a bruise. His reading glasses lay folded on top of a mystery novel he'd never finish, bookmarked at page 47. The cushion of his favorite chair still held the indent of his body. She'd caught herself trying not to look at it, then forcing herself to look, then looking away again, in a cycle that exhausted her. Everything waited. The house felt like a held breath. She touched objects without purpose, running her fingers along the kitchen counter where he used to stand, reading the newspaper, adjusting the thermostat he'd always kept 2 degrees too cold, straightening the coat hooks by the door where his winter jacket hung between her raincoat and Marcus's denim vest. Small gestures toward order in a world that had stopped making sense 6 months ago when the doctor said inoperable, 3 months ago when David stopped going to the workshop, 3 weeks ago when they lowered him into frozen ground while a minister said words about peace that felt like stones in her mouth. Her 17-year-old son occupied the house like a ghost. Marcus appeared for silent meals, oatmeal eaten standing at the counter, sandwiches consumed in 4 mechanical bites, before retreating to his room, where bass-heavy music leaked through the closed door at volumes that suggested he was trying to drown something out. He wore his father's old flannel shirts, forest green and faded blue plaid, 3 sizes too large with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The fabric swallowed his thin frame. He moved with the careful slowness of someone afraid of breaking something else. His footsteps deliberate on the stairs, his hands gentle when he set down his plate. His grief was different from hers, more angular, more silent, trapped behind a teenage boy's reluctance to cry in front of his mother. She'd heard him once, late at night through the shared wall between their rooms, a sound like something tearing. By morning, his eyes were red, but his face was closed, and when she'd reached for him, he'd stepped back with a small shake of his head. "Not yet. I can't yet," she understood. Some things couldn't be spoken until you found the language for them. The workshop behind the house remained locked, exactly as David had left it when the diagnosis came. Claire passed its dusty windows on her way to check the mail, averting her eyes from the shadowed shapes of projects abandoned mid-creation. Through the grimy glass, she could make out the ghost outline of his workbench, tools hanging on their shadow board. The half-built something covered by a tarp in the back corner. The brass padlock caught afternoon sun and threw it back, bright and accusing. Sometimes she thought she heard phantom sounds, the high whine of a table saw, the rhythmic scratch of sanding, David's off-key humming of Eagles songs before remembering that the silence was real and absolute. The workshop had been his sanctuary, the place where he translated ideas into solid things, where his hands spoke languages his mouth sometimes couldn't. Now it stood locked and waiting, another held breath in a house full of them. One evening in late November, sorting through David's winter coat for donation the church was collecting for families who needed warm clothing, and she couldn't bear to see it hanging unused, Claire's hand closed around something in the deep inner pocket. A weight, unexpected. Her fingers recognized metal before her mind caught up. A brass key, heavy and worn, smooth, attached to a wooden tag by a leather cord. She pulled it into the bedroom's yellow lamplight. The tag was walnut, she thought. Or maybe Cherry David had taught her wood types once, patient lessons she'd mostly forgotten, carved into its surface in his careful, precise script. Promise. She didn't recognize it immediately. Had never seen this key before, though she'd lived with David for 20 years, had folded his clothes and emptied his pockets 1,000 times. The key sat in her palm, gathering warmth from her skin, gathering significance she couldn't quite name. Outside, streetlights flickered on one by one down the block, their sodium glow turning the November dusk orange. "Mom!" She turned. Marcus stood in the doorway, his father's flannel hanging open over a white t-shirt, his hands shoved deep in his jeans pockets. His eyes went to the key in her hand, and something passed between them, recognition without words, understanding without explanation. He knew what it opened before she said anything. His hand lifted, reaching toward the key, then pulled back halfway as if touching an electric fence. She saw want and fear wrestling in his expression, 17 years old, and trying to hold himself together, trying to be the man his father had been raising him to become, trying not to break in front of her the way she was trying not to break in front of him. "Tomorrow," Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. Neither of them had said where they would use it. Neither needed to. Marcus nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin, and turned back toward his room. She heard his door close with the careful quietness he'd adopted since the funeral, as if loud noises might shatter whatever fragile thing was holding them both together. Claire set the key on the kitchen counter, on the cool granite David had installed himself 5 years ago. It sat there through the evening while she made tea she didn't drink. It sat there while she watched television she didn't see. It sat there overnight, small and brass and heavy as a promise carved in wood, gathering weight in the darkness while the house creaked its night sounds around it. By morning, it would open a door that had been locked for 6 months. By morning, they would step through a threshold neither of them could see beyond. But tonight, it simply waited, patient as grief, inevitable as memory, one small brass key holding the shape of everything they'd lost and everything they might still find. The next morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of November brightness that made everything look sharper than it should. Claire stood at the kitchen window with the brass key in her hand, watching frost melt off the workshop's tin roof in the climbing Sunday. She'd barely slept, kept seeing the carved word promise in the dark behind her eyelids, kept wondering what David had meant, what he'd known they would need to find. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing yesterday's clothes, his father's flannel wrinkled from sleep. He looked at her, at the key, at the workshop visible through the window. Neither spoke. Some decisions didn't need discussion. They crossed the backyard together, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Dead leaves crunched under their feet. The maple David had planted when Marcus was born had dropped its entire canopy in one October windstorm, and neither of them had raked. The workshop sat at the property's back edge, a single-story structure David had built himself the year they bought the house, back when Marcus was 3 and everything felt possible. The brass padlock hung heavy on the door, its surface patinated green in places, rust blooming at the keyhole. Claire fitted the key with hands that shook from cold or grief or anticipation. She couldn't say. The key resisted at first, months of disuse making the mechanism stubborn. She had to jiggle it, apply pressure, feel for the alignment David would have found instantly. Then, click. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet morning, final as a door closing or a coffin lid. Marcus stood 2 steps behind her, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched against more than cold. When she glanced back, he gave the smallest nod. "Go ahead. I'm here. I'm ready, even though I'm not." The padlock fell open in her palm. She worked it free from the hasp, set it on the frost-brittle grass. The door swung inward on hinges that creaked with 6 months of silence, releasing a breath of captured air that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and something else, something indefinably David, his presence concentrated and preserved like a photograph of scent. Inside, everything waited exactly as he'd left it. Tools hung on shadow boards along the walls. their outlines drawn in black marker so each piece knew its home. Hammer, square, 3 sizes of screwdrivers, the hand plane he'd inherited from his father. Sawdust coated every surface like snow that never melted, undisturbed except by time and the slow drift of air. The particles lay thick on the workbench, on the stool, on the windowsills where spiders had built webs between the glass and the screens. Half-empty cans of finish lined one shelf, their labels sun-faded to pastels. A coffee mug sat near the vise, the dried remnant of his last cup creating a dark ring at the bottom. Light from the high windows cut through floating dust particles, turning the air luminous and alive. Motes swirled in the disturbance of their entry, dancing like snow in a shaken globe. Claire moved first, one hand trailing along the workbench edge, her fingertips coming away gritty with dust and fine wood particles. Her fingers left tracks in the coating evidence of presence, of touch, the first marks made in this space since David had walked out for the last time. The texture felt both familiar and strange, like touching a memory made solid. Marcus followed more slowly, his careful footsteps unchanged from the house, but somehow different here. Reverent, tentative, as if walking through a church or a grave. He stopped at the toolboard where his father's work gloves hung from a wooden peg, their fingers curved as if still holding phantom handles. Brown leather worn soft at the palms, stiff with dried sweat and wood oil, sized for hands larger than his own. He didn't touch them. Not yet. The space was smaller than he remembered from childhood visits, or maybe he'd just grown, but it felt enormous with absence, every corner holding a conversation they'd never finish. All the times his father had said, "Come help me with this," and Marcus had said maybe later because he had homework or friends or a video game that seemed more important than learning to cut a straight line. All those maybe laters had run out. In the back corner, partially hidden by a paint-splattered canvas tarp, something waited with the shape of furniture. Claire moved toward it, Marcus following, and together they lifted the tarp's edge. Dust billowed. Beneath, an unfinished rocking chair, beautiful, even incomplete. The curved runners were shaped but unsanded, the back spindles cut to length but not assembled, the seat formed but not attached. Beside it, weighted down by a can of stain, a folded piece of paper in David's careful handwriting. Claire picked it up, unfolded it with fingers that had stopped shaking, and started trembling a different thing. Deeper. 4 words only. For our first. Her breath caught. A small sound like something breaking. Marcus stood close enough to read over her shoulder but didn't ask what it meant. Some griefs didn't need translation. He knew about the years of trying. The miscarriages his parents thought he'd been too young to understand. The nursery that stayed empty, then became his father's office, then became storage. His father had been building something for a grandchild who might never exist, starting a promise he couldn't finish. Marcus turned away, needing distance from that particular hurt, and his gaze landed on the shelf above the workbench. A row of cardboard tubes stood at attention against the wall, dusty cylinders bound with brittle rubber bands that had dried and cracked with time. Blueprints, he realized. His father's work plans, filed away for what? Future projects? Reference? He'd never seen David draw blueprints. His father had worked from instinct and experience, measuring twice and cutting once, building from vision rather than paper. Marcus reached for the nearest tube. The rubber band snapped as he touched it, disintegrating into brittle fragments. He slid out rolled papers that crackled with age and dryness, their edges yellowed, their surface slightly damp-feeling from months in the unheated workshop. He spread them carefully on the dust-coated workbench, Claire moving to his side. Not one blueprint. Dozens. Sheet after sheet of his father's neat drafting, precise lines in pencil and ink, measurements noted in the margins, materials lists attached with rusted staples. All dated within the last year, the most recent just weeks before David had stopped coming out here. each sheet labeled across the top in David's block letters: community playground equipment, free build. Below, in smaller script, legacy project Hashone. Claire pulled another tube, then another. More blueprints unfurled across the bench. A wheelchair-accessible sandbox with ramped entry and raised edges. An adaptive swing set with specialized seats and transfer platforms. A sensory play structure with textured panels and musical elements. The drawings were meticulous, professional quality work. Each measurement noted, each joint labeled, each piece of hardware specified down to screw size and finish type. In the margin of the sandbox plans, David's handwriting in the neat script he used for important things. Every kid deserves to build memories. Every parent deserves to watch them play. Marcus's hand shook as he traced the ink lines, his fingers following the curve of an accessible ramp, the angle of a support beam. His father had been dying, had known he was dying, and had spent his final healthy months thinking about other people's children, designing spaces for kids he'd never meet, creating play structures for families he'd never know, building a legacy that had nothing to do with his own name and everything to do with what he could give. Claire made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Her hand found Marcus's shoulder, squeezed once, and he felt through that touch everything neither of them could say. Grief, and pride, and confusion, and something else. Something that felt almost like purpose stirring in the ruins of their loss. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher. Inside the workshop, dust continued its slow spiral through light, and 17 cardboard tubes waited on their shelf, each one holding another piece of David's final vision, a map they were only beginning to understand. They spent the afternoon unrolling tube after tube, the workshop floor gradually disappearing beneath a landscape of David's final vision. 17 projects in total, each blueprint crackling as they spread it flat, weighted at the corners with coffee cans and hand tools to keep the paper from curling back into itself. Not just playgrounds, though, there were 3 of those, each designed for different age groups and abilities. Park benches with built-in book exchanges, little free libraries integrated into the armrests, bus stop shelters with solar panels feeding LED lighting for winter evenings, community garden raised beds designed for wheelchair access, the height calibrated precisely, drainage systems detailed, a covered pavilion for the farmer's market, its roof structure engineered to support hanging plants and string lights. Each blueprint was complete, ready to build. Not sketches or rough ideas, but finished plans accompanied by material lists, hardware specifications, estimated costs down to the penny. David had researched every detail Claire could see it in the notes crowding the margins, the alternative materials listed with pros and cons, the structural calculations that showed he'd consulted engineering tables and building codes. This wasn't a dying man's fantasy. This was a builder's legacy, carefully prepared for other hands to complete. Marcus moved between the spread blueprints like someone navigating a minefield, careful where he stepped, uncertain what might detonate. His father's handwriting covered every sheet neat block letters for labels, smaller cursive for notes, tiny sketches illustrating joinery details. It was like reading David's thoughts, following his mind as it worked through problems and found solutions, and the intimacy of it made Marcus's chest ache. He knelt beside the workbench, reaching beneath the shelf where the blueprint tubes had stood. His fingers found something else, a worn spiral notebook, its cover water-stained, pages swollen from humidity. He pulled it out, opened it, and his father's world expanded again. Pages filled with David's tight script, grant applications he'd drafted to the community foundation, itemizing costs and explaining his vision. Lists of local hardware stores with notes beside each. Miller's friendly owner, ask about bulk discount. Hanson's good selection, but pricey. Build Mart corporate, try anyway. Contact information for disability advocacy groups, names and phone numbers of people who'd agreed to review his accessibility designs, notes from conversations with the city parks department, bureaucratic requirements decoded into plain language. The last entry was dated 1 week before David became too sick to leave the house. Marcus read it aloud without meaning to, his voice catching on his father's words. Miller's Lumber said yes to 40% discount. Mr. Chen at the high school thinks shop class could help. Claire will know what to do. Claire looked up from the pavilion blueprint she'd been studying, her hands going still. He wrote my name? Marcus handed her the notebook, watched her flip through pages of planning that represented months of work done in secret while his body failed him. While he'd been telling them he was just tinkering out here, keeping his hands busy, he'd been building this not with wood and nails, but with words and drawings and phone calls, constructing a future he wouldn't live to see. He was planning this for months, Claire said, her voice strange, not quite steady, not quite broken. While he was getting sicker, he was. She didn't finish, couldn't finish, but Marcus understood. While his father was dying, he'd been designing ways for the community to live better. While his own body was betraying him, he'd been thinking about children who needed accessible play spaces, about commuters who needed sheltered bus stops, about neighbors who needed gathering places. The generosity of it made something crack in Marcus's chest, anger mixing with pride, mixing with grief in proportions he couldn't measure. Anger that his father had spent his final strength on strangers instead of fighting harder to stay. Pride that David had thought beyond himself, even when the world was shrinking to hospital rooms and pain medication schedules. Grief that this extraordinary man had been his father and Marcus had spent 17 years taking that for granted, assuming there would always be more time to learn from him, to become someone David could be proud of. Marcus backed away from the workbench, suddenly needing distance from the blueprints and the notebook, and the weight of his father's vision pressing down on him. His shoulder blades hit the toolboard and he stopped there, breathing hard, his hands curling into fists in his coat pockets. "We can't do this," he said, and heard how young his voice sounded, how small. "Mom, we're not. I'm not." He gestured at the blueprints, at the workshop, at everything his father was that he wasn't. "We don't know how to build any of this." The work gloves hung on their peg inches from his head, his father's hands preserved in leather, and they felt like an accusation. His father had been extraordinary, had designed 17 community projects while dying, had negotiated discounts and recruited volunteers, had built half the houses in their neighborhood and fixed twice as many. Marcus could barely pass shop class. He'd gotten a C- last semester, and that was with his teacher going easy on him because everyone knew his dad was sick. Claire sat down on David's work stool, the seat creaking under her weight after months unused. She ran her hands over the nearest blueprint, the playground, the one labeled Legacy Project Hazone, her fingers moving as if reading Braille. Then her hand stopped, pressed flat against the margin where David's handwriting crowded the paper. "Marcus has good hands," she read aloud, her voice careful. "He just doesn't know it yet." Marcus felt his face go hot, his throat tight. His mother was watching him, waiting for something, but he didn't know what. The words sat in the air between them, his father's belief from beyond death, and Marcus wanted to believe them but couldn't. Wanted to be the person David had thought he was but didn't know how. "Your father left these for someone to build," Claire said finally, carefully, like she was testing the weight of each word before releasing it. "Maybe not us. Maybe we find the right people. Make sure it happens." She was offering him an out, a way to honor David's legacy without drowning in the impossibility of continuing it. They could be stewards, not builders. Could make sure the work got done without pretending they were capable of doing it themselves. But Marcus was staring at the unfinished rocking chair in the corner, thinking about the note tucked beside it. "For our first, His parents had tried for years to have another child after him. He knew this now, understood it in a way his younger self hadn't. Years of hope and loss, doctor's appointments, his teenage self-absorption had barely registered, a nursery painted and then repainted back to neutral. His father had started building something for a grandchild who might never exist, had planned for a future that required Marcus to grow up, find someone, build a family of his own, had died before completing even that small promise. The chair sat there, half-finished, the curved runners smooth but the spindles unassembled. A project interrupted mid-creation just like the 17 blueprints scattered across the floor. His father had started so many things, had believed in futures he wouldn't see, had trusted that someone would continue what he began. "What if we tried?" Marcus said, so quietly it might have been to himself. "Just start. See what happens." Claire looked up, her eyes finding his across the cluttered workshop. In the late afternoon, light slanting through the high windows, dust still hung suspended in the air between them, gold and luminous, and slowly settling. Outside, the November day was fading toward evening. Inside, 17 projects waited like seeds David had planted, and Marcus could almost feel his father's hands on his shoulders, steady and patient, teaching him how to measure twice and cut once, how to trust the tools and trust his hands, and believe that what seemed impossible might just be difficult instead. "Okay," Claire said, and her voice was steadier than Marcus had heard it in months. "Okay, we'll try." They started on a Saturday morning in January, 6 weeks after finding the key, the workshop cold enough to see their breath. Frost painted the inside of the windows in fractal patterns, and the space heater Claire had dragged from the garage labored against the chill, its orange coils glowing like a small defiant Sunday. Marcus stood before the unfinished rocking chair, his father's plans spread on the workbench beside it, weighted flat with a carpenter's square and a half-empty can of wood stain. He'd watched his father work in here hundreds of times, standing in the doorway after school while David shaped wood into furniture, fixed neighbors' broken chairs, built custom cabinets for kitchen renovations. He'd watched the way his father's hands moved with certainty, selecting tools without looking, measuring by eye as often as with tape, working with the easy confidence of someone who understood materials at a level deeper than instruction. Watching had seemed like learning. It wasn't. Now, standing here with tools in reach and the unfinished chair waiting, the gap between watching and doing yawned impossibly wide. His hands felt stupid, uncertain where to begin. The spindles needed cutting to final length. David had rough-cut them but left the precision work undone. The rockers required final sanding. The seat needed attachment. Marcus knew what needed doing. He had no idea how to do it. Claire moved to his side, her finger tracing David's notation on the plans, neat pencil lines with measurements written beside them. Arrows indicating assembly order, small sketches showing how joints should fit together. "This piece," she said, tapping a diagram, "needs to be exactly 12 3/4 inches. He's marked which end to cut from C. The grain pattern matters for strength." She didn't know much more than Marcus, had never built anything more complex than IKEA furniture, but David had labeled everything carefully, had written notes in the margins as if anticipating confusion. Together, they decoded his final instructions, like archaeologists reading an ancient language, puzzling out meaning from notation and symbol, from the careful way he'd organized partially completed pieces. "He knew," Claire said softly, the realization landing as she spoke it. "He knew we'd be the ones trying to understand this." Marcus selected a spindle, carried it to the miter saw his father had mounted on the far workbench. The tool looked predatory, its circular blade catching light, its angle gauge marked with David's pencil notations for common cuts. Marcus had seen his father use this saw 1,000 times. The smooth motion of aligning the wood, the careful descent of the blade, the clean separation of waste from keeper. He positioned the spindle, checked the measurement twice, pulled the trigger. The blade screamed to life, and Marcus guided it down. But his hands weren't steady, and the wood wasn't clamped properly, and the blade wandered, biting at an angle, the cut ending up 3 degrees off true. He released the trigger, stared at the ruined spindle, felt his throat go tight with frustration that tasted like failure. Dad would have done it right the first time, he said, before he could stop himself. The workshop swallowed the words. The space heater's hum, the only response. Claire didn't correct him, didn't offer empty comfort or false equivalence. She picked up another spindle from the pile of rough-cut pieces, handed it to Marcus, and said simply, "Try again." He would have tried again, too. Marcus took the wood, its surface still bearing the marks of his father's initial shaping. He adjusted his grip, this time clamping the piece properly, taking longer to align the blade, breathing steadier. The second cut was better, not perfect, a fraction of a degree still off, but usable. The third cut was clean, the blade parting wood smooth and true, the angle exactly what the plan specified. A small victory. So minor his father wouldn't have noticed it, wouldn't have remarked on something that basic. Marcus noticed. He set the piece aside with the others that would become the chair's back, lined up another cut, felt something that might have been confidence beginning to take shape in his hands. The work was slower than he'd imagined, more physical. His hands cramped around unfamiliar tool handles, the grip all wrong, until Claire showed him how to hold the sander the way David's notes described, firm but not rigid, letting the tool's weight do the work. Sawdust worked into the creases of his palms, got under his collar, made him sneeze 3 times in succession. A splinter buried itself beneath his thumbnail and throbbed with his pulse. But he kept working, afraid that stopping would break whatever fragile momentum they'd found. Fresh sawdust began mixing with old, pale, new shavings, falling onto the 6-month layer of gray dust that coated everything. The workshop was waking up, returning to life, its air no longer stale and preserved but active with creation. The smell changed too sharp and green, the scent of cut wood replacing the must of abandonment. They worked in long stretches of silence, broken only by Claire reading aloud from David's notes, sand with the grain, never against, test the joint before gluing. Patience is cheaper than wood, or Marcus asking her to hold a piece steady while he marked it. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of purpose, concentration, the soft sounds of creation. Sandpaper on wood, pencil on paper, the click of the tape measure retracting. When Marcus's stomach growled loud enough to echo off the workshop walls, they both startled, looking up like sleepers waking. The windows had gone dark. The space heater had cycled off and on 3 times. Claire's fingers were cramping from holding pieces steady. Marcus's shoulders ached from unfamiliar postures, muscles he didn't know he had announcing themselves through fatigue. "We should eat," Claire said, but neither moved. 5 more minutes, Marcus replied, and she nodded, understanding that stopping felt like surrender, like admitting they couldn't sustain what they'd started. By the time they finally quit, late afternoon had faded to evening, the workshop lit only by the overhead fluorescents David had installed. Their light harsh and honest. The workbench was covered with pieces, all the spindles cut and sanded, the rockers smooth and true, the seat frame shaped and ready for assembly. Components laid out in the order they'd be joined, waiting to become something whole. It didn't look like much. Not yet a chair, just pieces that might become one if they didn't ruin them in assembly. But Marcus ran his hand along a rocker, feeling the curve his father had shaped, the smoothness he and Claire had refined, and felt something shift inside his chest, not confidence exactly, but possibility. The sense that it could work, that they could actually build this, His father had designed it to be completable, had broken the work into manageable pieces, had left instructions clear enough to follow, had believed that Marcus's hands, clumsy and uncertain and young as they were, would be good enough, had believed it even before Marcus did. Claire stood beside him, her hand finding his shoulder, and together they looked at what they'd accomplished. One day's work, one small step, 11 pieces of wood that might become a rocking chair if they kept going. Outside, January darkness pressed against the windows. Inside, the workshop held them both, and for the first time since David died, the space didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a map showing them where they might go next, if they were brave enough to follow. 3 weeks into the project, the rocking chair took its final form. Marcus ran his hand along the armrest one last time, checking for roughness he might have missed, but the wood was smooth as water under his palm. 3 coats of finish, making the cherry glow honey-warm in the workshop's overhead light. Every joint was tight, every spindle aligned, the seat curved exactly as his father's plans had specified. It looked like something you'd find in a craft store, something made by hands that knew what they were doing. He sat in it carefully, his weight settling into the curved seat his father had shaped, and pushed off with one foot. The rockers moved beneath him with the gentle rhythm David had calculated, not too fast, not resistant, just right for holding a sleeping child, or reading a book, or sitting in quiet while the world moved around you. It worked. After 3 weeks of mistakes and recuts and sanding until his arms ached, it actually worked. "It's beautiful," Claire said from the doorway, and Marcus heard the catch in her voice, the surprise that they'd actually done this impossible thing. She circled the chair with her phone, photographing it from every angle, the curve of the runners, the way light caught the finish, the joinery that held everything together. Evidence that David's design could become real in someone else's hands. Evidence that those hands could be theirs. They carried it inside together, Marcus walking backward through the kitchen door, Claire guiding him past the table and through the living room to the corner where David's reading chair had sat for 15 years. That chair had gone to Goodwill 2 weeks ago, the first thing they'd changed since the funeral. Now the rocking chair claimed the space smaller, lighter, built for a different purpose but holding the same corner, filling the absence with presence. The workshop changed too. No longer a shrine but an active space, a place where things happened instead of where things waited. Fresh sawdust mixed with old in layers you could read like tree rings gray dust from 6 months of stillness, then pale new shavings from 3 weeks of work. Tools returned to the bench worn from use, their handles showing oil from Marcus's palms, the saw blade dulled enough to need sharpening. His math homework spread beside blueprint tubes, pencil calculations for derivatives living next to his father's calculations for load-bearing joints. Claire had brought a space heater that actually worked, and a radio that played the classic rock stations David had loved, Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, and Tom Petty, filling the silence that used to feel sacred, but now just felt empty without sound. Sometimes Marcus caught himself humming along while he sanded, the same off-key humming his father used to do, and the recognition didn't hurt the way he'd expected. It felt like company. The room still held David's memory, his tools, his gloves on their peg, his handwriting on every blueprint and note, but now it held their present too. A conversation across time. The dead and living working together, hands building what other hands had designed. One evening, Marcus sat at the workbench with his father's worn notebook open to a page near the end. Names and phone numbers, people David had contacted about the community projects. Most were crossed out with notes beside them moved. Not interested, maybe later. But one name wasn't crossed out. Mr. Chen, shop teacher at Marcus's high school, with a notation in David's neat script. Interested, enthusiastic, wait for right time. Marcus picked up his phone before he could think too hard about it, dialed the number with fingers that wanted to shake. 3 rings, Then a voice. Chen. Hi. This is Marcus. His voice came out uncertain, teenage thin. He cleared his throat, tried again. Marcus Williams. I'm David Williams's son. I found your name in my dad's notebook, and I wanted to. He paused, gathering the explanation that was too big for a phone call, then just set it straight. My dad had plans for community builds, playgrounds and stuff. He talked to you about it before he got sick. Silence on the other end, long enough that Marcus wondered if the call had dropped. Then Chen's voice thick with emotion. David talked about this before he got sick, showed me some of the designs. I told him I was in, that my students would love to be part of something like that. A pause, a breath. That hasn't changed. Chen visited the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon. A stocky man in his 50s, with calloused hands and reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He moved through the space like someone who understood workshops, noting the tool organization, the clean workbench, the evidence of recent use. His eyes landed on the rocking chair in the corner Marcus had brought it back out to show him, and he ran his hand along the armrest, the same way Marcus had, checking joints with a builder's instinct. You made this? He asked Marcus, and Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Your first real project? Another nod. Chen smiled. Your father taught you well, even if you didn't know he was teaching you. They unrolled David's playground blueprints across the workbench, the paper crackling as it spread flat. Chen studied them with a builder's eye, occasionally making appreciative noises, a low whistle at the accessible sandbox design, a murmured smart at the adaptive swing set's transfer platform. His finger traced the structural details, the hardware specifications, the notes David had made about material choices. Your father knew what he was doing, he said to Marcus. These are solid designs, buildable, safe. Better than half the playground equipment you see at big parks. He looked at Claire. With school district permission and the right volunteers, we could make this happen. Spring build, if we start planning now. That night, after Chen left with photocopies of 3 blueprints and a promise to talk to the school board, Claire and Marcus spread all 17 blueprints across the living room floor. They'd looked at them individually in the workshop, but seeing them together all at once, the full scope laid out was different. Not individual projects, but a comprehensive reimagining of their town's public spaces. Park benches and playgrounds, bus shelters and garden beds, every design accessible and beautiful, meant to serve everyone, regardless of age or ability. He was building a legacy, Claire said, seeing it finally. Understanding what David had been doing in those final months while his body failed him. Not buildings, a way of thinking about community. Marcus knelt beside the playground plans, his finger tracing the wheelchair-accessible sandbox that would be Legacy Project Hajon. He thought about kids who would play here, families who would gather, parents watching their children build memories in spaces his father had designed. None of them would know a dying man had dreamed them into existence, had spent his final strength making sure everyone could play, everyone could gather, everyone could belong. They made a list, Claire writing in the same notebook where David had written his, a conversation continuing across pages. Parks Department, disability advocacy groups, Miller's Lumber, the local newspaper, names and phone numbers, tasks and timelines, the work ahead enormous and impossible and necessary. Marcus sat back on his heels, looking at 17 blueprints that represented hundreds of hours of work, thousands of dollars in materials, coordination with city departments and volunteer schedules and construction timelines, far beyond completing one rocking chair, far beyond anything he'd thought himself capable of 3 weeks ago. But something unfamiliar was rising in his chest, not confidence exactly, but possibility. The sense that impossible might just mean difficult, that enormous might just mean step by step, that his father had started this precisely so someone else could continue it. The blueprints were the map. Now they needed builders willing to follow it. And for the first time since finding that brass key in his father's coat pocket, Marcus thought they might actually find them. The local newspaper ran the feature on a Thursday morning in late February. Dying Father's Final Gift. Blueprints for Community Transformation. The headline made Claire wince. Too sentimental, too clean, reducing David's complicated final months to a neat narrative arc. But the article itself was careful, respectful. They'd photographed Marcus in the workshop holding his father's playground plans, Claire standing beside the completed rocking chair with her hand on its curved back. Marcus looked older in the photo than he did in real life. Something about the angle, the workshop light, the way he held the blueprints like they mattered. He read the article 3 times that morning, once at breakfast, and twice more when he thought Claire wasn't watching. Seeing his father's work honored publicly, seeing his own name in print as David's son, seeing the words legacy and community and transformation applied to blueprints he'd unrolled with shaking hands 3 months ago. The phone started ringing before noon. Volunteers appeared from unexpected places. A retired contractor named Bill, who'd worked with David on a housing development 15 years ago, offering his weekends and his truck. 2 college students from the state school, needing service hours for their education degrees. A woman named Patricia, whose 8-year-old daughter used a wheelchair and had never had playground equipment designed for her. Her voice breaking on the phone when Claire explained the accessible sandbox, the transfer platform on the swings, the sensory elements at reachable heights. Mr. Chen's shop class committed officially, the school district approving it as a community service project. Miller's Lumber honored the discount David had negotiated, the owner remembering him as the guy who always bought quality, never the cheap stuff. A local architect named Sarah offered to review the plans for code compliance, pro bono, because David had built her daughter's wheelchair ramp 5 years ago and refused payment. The community David had served as a carpenter for 20 years was returning the service, 1 phone call at a time. The workshop became a planning center. Saturday meetings with 15 people crowded around the workbench, the space heater working overtime, coffee cups accumulating on every flat surface some Claire recognized from their kitchen, others brought by volunteers who'd started showing up early to help prep. Claire coordinated schedules on a whiteboard David had used for project timelines, her handwriting filling columns with names and tasks and deadlines, volunteer sign-up sheets, material delivery schedules, contact lists growing longer every day. Marcus stood at the workbench explaining his father's designs with something that looked like confidence from a distance, but felt more like necessity up close. He knew these blueprints better than anyone now, had studied every notation, memorized every measurement, understood the logic behind David's choices because he'd spent 3 months decoding his father's intentions. When Bill asked about the sandbox's drainage system, Marcus could answer. When Sarah questioned the swing set's structural load, Marcus showed her David's calculations. When Patricia wanted to know about the sensory panel textures, Marcus explained the research notes his father had made about tactile development. People twice his age listened when he spoke. It was proud-making and terrifying in equal measure. The work gloves hung on their peg. Watching this transformation, David's gloves worn dark at the palms, and beside them now, Marcus's own pair, still stiff and new but getting softer with use. The workshop held both their tools now, both their handwriting on the whiteboard, both their coffee cups on the bench. The space had become something neither David nor Marcus alone could have made it a hybrid, a collaboration across death, a father's sanctuary transformed into a son's inheritance and a community's gathering place. But the attention suffocated sometimes. Strangers at the grocery store stopping Claire to talk about David. Their memories of him fixing their porches or building their decks. Their voices going soft with sympathy that made her want to scream. Marcus's high school teachers suddenly knowing who he was, asking about the project in that careful tone adults used when they wanted to seem supportive but mostly wanted to confirm they'd read about you in the paper. One evening in early March, Marcus found Claire in the workshop staring at the whiteboard, her arms crossed tight across her chest. "Everyone loved Dad," he said, the words coming out harder than he'd meant them. "Everyone wants to do this for him. They think it's this beautiful thing he left behind." He gestured at the blueprints, the volunteer lists, the material schedules. "What if we mess it up? What if the sandbox is wrong, or the swing set isn't safe, or—" He stopped hearing the fear underneath the words. "What if we're not good enough to finish what he started?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She turned from the whiteboard, pulled a blueprint tube they hadn't opened yet, from the shelf one of the later projects. A pavilion design they'd planned to tackle after the playground. She handed it to Marcus, watched him unroll it across the workbench. Playground designs, yes, but on the back of one sheet, David's handwriting in the margins where he thought no one would look. "They'll make mistakes. That's part of building. Give them permission to be imperfect." Marcus read it twice, his throat tight. His father had known, had anticipated this exact moment, the weight of inheritance, the fear of failure, the paralysis that came from trying to be worthy of someone extraordinary, and had left them permission to be human instead of perfect, to build badly if necessary, to try and fail and try again because that's what building was. "He left us instructions for this too," Claire said quietly. "For the part where we're scared, the first build date was set for a Saturday in mid-March, weather permitting. The wheelchair-accessible sandbox, David's legacy project Hajon, at Riverside Park. Materials were donated and staged in the public works yard. Lumber, hardware, sand, concrete for the footings. Chen's students had pre-built the ramp sections in shop class, their measurements exact, their joints tight. 27 volunteers had signed up, then 32, then 40. The list kept growing. Late Friday night before the build, Marcus and Claire stood in the empty workshop with the playground blueprint spread before them, one last time, before it became something real instead of theoretical. The paper was creased now from being rolled and unrolled dozens of times, annotated with Sarah's code compliance notes, marked with Claire's material quantities, worn soft at the edges from being handled by so many people who wanted to help make David's vision concrete. "You ready for this?" Claire asked. Marcus picked up his father's work gloves from their pegs still too large, the fingers extending past his own, but he'd grown into them better over 3 months of work. His hands were calloused now, the soft teenager's hands replaced by something harder, more capable. His shoulders had broadened from lifting lumber. His posture had straightened from standing at workbenches explaining designs to adults who treated his knowledge as authority. He'd stopped wearing his father's oversized flannels somewhere along the way, not because he was forgetting, but because he'd found his own way to carry David forward. Through blueprints and calluses, and the confidence that came from knowing something deeply enough to teach it, through purpose that felt like inheritance, through grief that had made space for building. His voice didn't hesitate anymore when explaining load-bearing joints or accessibility requirements. He still grieved some mornings. He woke surprised all over again that his father was gone, that 3 months had passed, that spring was coming and David wouldn't see it. But the grief lived alongside something else now, something that felt like grace. "Yeah," Marcus said, pulling on the gloves. "I'm ready." Outside, March wind rattled the workshop windows. Inside, the blueprint waited to become playground. Theory waited to become practice. And a 17-year-old boy stood in his father's workspace, wearing gloves that were almost his size, ready to build something that would outlast them all. The March morning arrived cold and bright, the kind of day where breath made clouds and sunlight made everything sharp-edged and clear. Volunteers gathered at Riverside Park by 8 a.m., their cars filling the gravel lot until people started parking on the street. Families with thermoses of coffee and children bundled in jackets. Chen's students arriving in matching shop class t-shirts, their teacher herding them toward the staging area with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd coordinated teenagers for 30 years. Retired contractors with personal tool bags worn smooth from decades of use, the leather handles shaped to hands that had built half the town. Marcus and Claire arrived at 7:30 to find they weren't first. Bill was already there, unloading his truck, and 2 of Chen's students were setting up the materials station. By 8, 40 people crowded the empty plot of land instead of the 27 who'd signed up. Someone had brought 3 boxes of donuts. Someone else had a portable speaker playing classic rock Tom Petty and Fleetwood Mac, the music David had worked to. Stakes marked where the sandbox would stand, orange string outlining its footprint against winter-brown grass. Marcus stood on a milk crate someone had provided, the crowd quieting as he raised his hand. His voice carried across the morning with an authority that surprised him, explaining the build sequence, safety protocols, which crews would handle foundation work and which would manage assembly. He wore his father's work gloves, still too large but manageable now, broken in from 3 months of workshop use. He and Claire had prepared laminated instruction sheets for each station. David's drawings simplified into step-by-step guides with safety reminders and material specifications. People listened. They took the instruction sheets, asked clarifying questions, divided into teams without argument or confusion. At 17, Marcus was leading a construction project with 40 volunteers, and only later would he realize how impossible that should have felt. In the moment, it just felt necessary. He knew the blueprints, knew his father's intentions, knew what needed doing. So he did it. The work unfolded in organized chaos. Digging teams broke ground for the foundation, post-hole diggers biting into half-frozen earth, the sound of metal on stone ringing across the park. Assembly crews connected the pre-built ramp panels Chen's students had constructed, checking alignment with levels and measuring tapes. At the materials station, Mr. Chen coordinated supplies like a general commanding troops calling out when screws were running low, directing someone to grab more 2x4s, ensuring every team had what they needed before they needed it. Marcus moved between stations with his father's blueprints tucked under one arm, troubleshooting problems before they became crises. When the digging crew hit unexpected clay 2 feet down, he consulted the foundation specs and authorized deeper holes with gravel drainage. When someone asked about the ramp's slope percentage, he explained the ADA requirements David had researched. When a wheelchair-accessible ramp angle didn't match the blueprint specifications off by 3 degrees, enough to make it too steep, he spotted it immediately. Recalculated using the Pythagorean theorem he'd barely passed in geometry class, directed the correction with certainty he didn't know he possessed. The crew members nodded, adjusted, rebuilt it right. No one questioned him. No one suggested waiting for adult confirmation. They trusted his knowledge because his knowledge was trustworthy, earned through 3 months of studying every notation his father had made. By noon, the structure was half complete, and rain threatened dark clouds rolling in from the west earlier than the forecast had predicted. There was a moment of collective uncertainty, 40 people glancing at the sky, at the half-built sandbox with its foundation set but its panels not yet secured, at Marcus, waiting for someone to make a decision before remembering he was the someone. "Secure what's vulnerable," he called out, his voice cutting through the uncertainty. "Cover the pre-built sections, keep working on what's weatherproof until the rain actually falls." It was exactly what his father would have decided work. Until you can't protect what matters, trust your people to move fast when needed. They worked faster, focused, the casual morning energy tightening into purposeful efficiency. Panels went up double time, crews coordinating without discussion, everyone understanding the stakes. The first raindrops held off until the last board was screwed into place, the final ramp section secured. When the rain finally came, A sudden downpour that turned the sky gray. They were eating lunch under a pop-up tent someone had thought to bring. The completed sandbox standing behind them in the rain, already beautiful, even unfinished. After lunch, as rain pattered steady on the tent fabric, and someone's phone played weather updates promising clearing by 2, Claire approached Marcus with an older woman he half recognized from the newspaper article responses. Mrs. Patterson, gray-haired and slight, her hands twisting a tissue. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "My granddaughter, Emma, she's 7, has cerebral palsy. She's never been able to play in a sandbox. The regular ones, the low sides and the sand at ground level, she can't." Mrs. Patterson gestured helplessly, unable to finish. But Marcus understood. Regular sandboxes required getting down to ground level, required balance and strength Emma didn't have. This one, with its raised edges and accessible ramps and transfer platforms, was designed specifically for children like her. Marcus nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak past the sudden weight of realization. His father had seen this need, had understood it deeply enough to design the solution, had researched the specifications, had imagined Emma before ever meeting her. But Marcus had made it real, had read those blueprints, led these volunteers, turned 2-dimensional drawings into 3-dimensional space where a 7-year-old girl could play for the first time. The distinction between David's vision and Marcus's execution mattered less than he'd thought it would. They were both necessary, both part of the same act of creation. By late afternoon, the rain cleared, the clouds breaking apart to reveal blue sky and slanting sunlight that turned puddles gold. The sandbox stood complete, accessible from all sides, the raised edges at perfect height, the ramp angles exact, the structure solid and true to every specification David had drawn. The sand would be delivered Monday, 50 bags of play sand, but the structure itself was done. First of 17 projects. Legacy Project Hashone, completed. Volunteers took photographs, posed their children beside it, called the local news station to send someone out. Chen's students gathered for a group photo, their shop class t-shirts muddy and their faces exhausted proud. Bill stood back examining joints with a contractor's critical eye, then nodded once, satisfied. Claire moved through the crowd, thanking people, her voice steady and warm, looking more like herself than she had in months. Marcus sat on the edge of the structure, his legs dangling, running his hand along a joint he'd personally supervised. The wood was smooth under his palm, properly sealed, the screws countersunk exactly right. His father's design, the community's labor, his own leadership, all of it, somehow. One thing, not separate contributions, but a unified act of building that couldn't have existed without every part. The March sun was setting, painting everything orange and pink. And Marcus sat in the structure his father had dreamed and he had built, wearing gloves that were almost his size, feeling something that might have been peace settling into the spaces grief had carved. 16 more projects waited. But this one was done. This one was real. And somewhere, he thought, his father knew. On a warm Saturday in late April, the Riverside Sandbox opened officially 50-pound bags of play sand delivered and spread. Safety inspections passed. A ribbon stretched across the accessible ramp, waiting for ceremonial scissors. The mayor came, and the park's director, and a photographer from the newspaper that had run the original story. But mostly there were families, dozens of them, children bouncing with anticipation while their parents held them back from the ribbon until the speeches finished. Marcus and Claire watched from the shade of an oak tree, standing slightly apart from the official ceremony, content to be witnesses rather than center of attention. The mayor said something about community and legacy and the power of one man's vision. Claire's hand found Marcus's shoulder, squeezed once. They'd heard these words before, knew the story people told about David's final gift, But they knew the fuller truth that the gift wasn't just blueprints, but the belief that his family could continue what he'd started, that inadequate hands could become capable through trying. When the ribbon finally fell, children swarmed the structure. Emma Patterson rolled up the accessible ramp in her wheelchair, her grandmother walking beside her with one hand on the chair's handle and the other pressed to her mouth. At the top of the ramp, Emma's hands plunged into sand for the first time in her 7 years. The texture, the way it moved and shifted and held the shape of her fingers. Her laugh carried across the park, pure and delighted, and her grandmother cried openly, not bothering to hide it. Marcus didn't cry, but it was close. 16 more projects waited in blueprint tubes back in the workshop. But this first one, this proof that David's vision could become children's reality, was real and being used and making someone laugh who'd never had access to simple joy like sand between fingers. The workshop had transformed entirely over the 2 months since that first build day. No longer a shrine or even just their family workspace, but a living space constantly active with community purpose. Chen's shop class had adopted it as a satellite workspace for the community builds. His students coming after school to pre-build components and learn from Marcus about reading blueprints and measuring twice. A volunteer schedule hung on the wall, color-coded by project and crew. Marcus's own drawings had started appearing beside his father's modifications to David's designs, additions suggested by occupational therapists, his handwriting less precise than his father's neat drafting but growing more confident with each notation. In one corner, Claire had claimed a small desk, David's old drafting table, actually, cleared of his projects and repurposed. She sat there sketching garden layouts for the raised bed project, discovering she had an eye for accessible design she'd never known to look for. Her lines were uncertain compared to David's or even Marcus's improving draftsmanship, but they were purposeful, creative, adding dimensions David hadn't considered because his expertise was carpentry, not cultivation. Marcus taught now. Younger volunteers, high school students from Chen's class, neighborhood kids who showed up curious about building and stayed because someone patient was willing to show them. He demonstrated proper saw technique, explained how to read measurements, corrected grip and stance with patience he didn't know he possessed until he found himself possessing it. Teaching forced him to understand deeply, to articulate what his hands had learned. One afternoon, a freshman named James, thin and uncertain with question mark posture Marcus recognized from his own reflection 6 months ago, asked if Marcus had always known how to build things. "No," Marcus said simply, honestly. "My dad taught me by leaving directions. I'm still learning." It was the most honest thing he'd said in months, and saying it felt like permission for James, for himself, for anyone who thought competence required certainty instead of just commitment to keep trying. Some projects proved harder than others. The pavilion design required engineering consultation beyond the blueprint's scope. A structural engineer volunteering her time to verify David's load calculations and suggest reinforcements. Material costs for the adaptive swing set exceeded initial estimates. Requiring grant applications and fundraising, Claire coordinated with the efficiency she'd developed, managing David's medical bills and insurance claims, skills born from crisis, repurposed for creation. Weather delays pushed timelines. Supply chain issues meant substituting materials, which meant recalculating specifications. Marcus learned that momentum wasn't constant, that continuing David's legacy meant adapting it, making decisions his father couldn't weigh in on because circumstances changed and needs evolved. It was harder than following exact plans, more uncertain, more prone to mistakes. But it was also where Marcus found his own voice inside his father's vision. Legacy wasn't replication. It was interpretation. It was taking what you inherited and making it speak to the world you actually lived in, not the world the original creator had imagined. On a June evening, golden light slanting through the workshop's high windows. Marcus found his mother at the workbench with an empty blueprint sheet spread before her and a set of drafting pencils she'd ordered online. New pencils, not David's worn ones. A subtle declaration that she was creating something new rather than continuing something old. "What are you working on?" he asked. She looked up, almost embarrassed. "The community garden raised beds, your dad's design is good, but I thought, what if we integrated a rainwater collection system? And maybe some sensory elements? Herbs that smell good when you brush them?" She was sketching as she spoke. Her lines uncertain but purposeful rosemary and lavender, positioned where wheelchairs would brush against them. A rain barrel feeding drip irrigation, modifications that made David's functional design more beautiful, more alive. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the drawing. "Dad would have loved that," he said, and meant it. David had designed for access and function. Claire was adding beauty and sensory joy, both necessary, both part of building spaces that served everyone. The rocking chair sat in the living room, used most nights Claire with a book, Marcus with homework spread across his lap, sometimes both of them just sitting while dinner cooked, rocking in the rhythm David had calculated. It had become the room's center. No longer empty space where David used to sit, but proof that absence could be transformed without being erased. Sometimes Marcus rocked and imagined his father sitting here decades from now, holding a grandchild who might exist someday. The promise completed in a future David had hoped for but wouldn't see. The grief of it coexisted with the beauty. Both truths held. On the workshop wall, Marcus had started a new section photographs of each completed project. Not just the structures, but the people using them. Emma in the sandbox, sand coating her wheelchair's armrests. Teenagers sheltering from rain in the bus stop David had designed, laughing while water streamed off the solar panel roof. Seniors resting on benches with built-in book exchanges, trading paperbacks and conversations. Every image was evidence that David's final work succeeded not just buildings, but community infrastructure that served and included everyone. 17 projects planned, 3 completed, 14 still waiting. The work continued. Late one night, in mid-June, Claire and Marcus sat in the workshop, the space lit only by the overhead workbench lamp, surrounded by blueprint tubes and half-empty coffee cups and sawdust that was now as much theirs as David's. They were planning the adaptive swing set build, 3 months away, coordinating with an occupational therapist to ensure it met needs. David could only imagine sensory integration, vestibular support, specifications that hadn't existed when he'd drawn the original plans. "Do you think Dad knew?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet in the workshop's stillness. "That we'd actually do this?" Claire considered, her finger tracing one of David's margin notes, "Keep building, keep including, keep remembering," words that served as instruction and benediction both. "I think he hoped," she said finally. "He left us the blueprints. We're making them real." Marcus picked up a pencil his own now, not borrowed, and added a note to the swing set plans. A small modification to the seat harness, something the OT had suggested based on recent research David hadn't lived to see. His handwriting beside his father's, different but complementary. His mother's garden sketches on the bench beside them. The work gloves, his father's worn pair, and Marcus's newer gloves beside them hung on their pegs. 2 generations of hands claiming the same tools, the same purpose. The workshop held all of it. Grief and purpose, memory and continuation, the dead and the living building together across time. Outside, late spring turned toward summer, June bugs hitting the windows, the first fireflies of the season blinking in the dark yard. Somewhere in town, children played on a sandbox a dying man had designed and his family had made real. Other structures waited to be built, other blueprints waited to be interpreted, Other needs waited to be met. The blueprints were the map. They were still following it, still learning what else might be possible when inheritance became action. When grief found its hands and built something larger than loss, when love transformed from what you'd lost into what you could give. Sometimes healing doesn't mean restoring what was broken. Sometimes it means learning to build differently with the same love, but new hands, creating spaces where others can gather and play and remember and belong. Legacy isn't about preserving the past unchanged. It's about carrying it forward, interpreting it for new needs, adding your own voice to the conversation across time. It's about taking the map someone drew when they still believed in futures they wouldn't see, and making those futures real, one blueprint, one project, one act of building at a time.